What is service model banking? Before defining the service model banking, which is called the new generation banking service sector and in which banks increase its scope by providing infrastructure to other sectors, some concepts will be mentioned in order to have a clearer information about service model banking, which is frequently used in the regulation, and the service banking model should be evaluated within the framework of these definitions. Open banking. In its simplest form, it is a model that means sharing the private financial data of customers in banks with the permission of customers. Interface provider. Businesses established as a capital company that enable their customers to perform banking transactions by accessing the banking services offered by the service bank through the bank's open banking services via a mobile application or an internet browser-based interface. After specifying what open banking and interface provider mean, to define the service model banking. Service model banking is a banking system where interface developers can directly connect with service banks' systems through APIs and open banking services to perform banking transactions on behalf of their customers through the service bank, so that interface developers can offer new products and services to the market by using the banking infrastructure owned by service banks. Service model. Service model banking is an important innovation within the scope of banking law, as it enables banking transactions outside of bank platforms and increases the cooperation between financial institutions and banks with the mutual winning model. Thanks to the said service banking model, it has been regulated that interface developers can directly connect with service banks' systems through APIs and open banking platforms, and perform banking transactions on behalf of customers through these services. With the service model banking, which is a turning point in terms of financial inclusion, financial institutions will start to provide banking services by creating their own ecosystems with different licenses and APIs. In international global applications, e-commerce, retail etc. companies, using the bank's infrastructure to provide their customers with services such as payment services, fund collection or customer funding, the service model banking service is a model that has been applied for a long time, and this model will start to be implemented in Turkey, both banks and finance sector. It is important for companies to enter the market. What are some regulations regarding service model banking? It is clearly regulated that it can provide service model banking services to interface providers and only within the framework of their own operating permits, and that banks cannot be interface providers. With the rules set in some countries, some restrictions have been imposed on the interface providers to which the service bank provides service. These, in their trade names, all kinds of documents, announcements and advertisements or statements made to the public without obtaining the necessary permissions. They may use the names of a payment service provider such as a bank or payment institution and an electronic money institution, or a deposit and participation fund such as a bank or a non-bank payment service provider in which they operate. They will not be able to use words and phrases that may give the impression that they are collecting funds or collecting funds, such as a payment service provider. At the same time, it has been tried to limit the services of the interface providers by stating that the service bank will decide whether to provide banking services to the customer through service model banking through the interface of the interface provider. It is clearly stated that in order for the service model banking to take place, that is, for the service bank to provide banking services to the customer of the interface provider, a contractual relationship must first be established between the said customer and the service bank. At the same time, the possibility of establishing a contractual relationship in electronic environment, which is possible in line with the developing technology, is also regulated. It has to be determined by the service bank in accordance with the remote identity detection methods to be used and the regulation on the establishment of a contract relationship in the electronic environment. Again, if the process of establishing a contractual relationship between the service bank and the customer is initiated via the mobile application or internet browser-based interface of the interface provider and completed through these service channels, the regulation on the information systems and electronic banking services of the banks of the said service channels of the interface provider. This issue is left to the responsibility of the service bank, by specifically stating that it must comply with the security criteria and provide assurance. With the rules set in some countries, important regulations have been made in terms of identity verification and transaction security, and the responsibility is not solely on the service bank. Among the services of the interface provider, besides receiving services from the service bank, it is clearly stated as mediating the establishment of a contractual relationship between the service bank and the customer. At the same time, it is possible for the service bank to receive support service from the interface provider by collecting credit card requests by arranging the supports that the service bank can receive from the interface provider. The interface provider and the service bank are jointly responsible for ensuring that the mobile application or internet browser-based interface of the interface provider used by the customer to access the services offered by the service bank complies with the identity verification and transaction security obligations of the Regulation on Information Systems of Banks and Electronic Banking Services. Responsibility to a single party has been avoided. In this regard, the service bank is prohibited from providing service model banking services and receiving support services from interface providers that do not fulfill these obligations or whose systems are insufficient to fulfill these obligations. With the rules set in some countries, it is accepted that the interface provider is a support service institution that provides services to the service bank within the scope of the Support Services Regulation. In some countries, the systems used by the interface provider to carry out its activities related to the support services offered to the service bank and the sharing of confidential information to be made by the service bank with the interface provider in this context are included in the exceptions from the confidentiality obligation pursuant to the confidentiality regulation. It is clearly stated that the transactions and the orders entered through the mobile application or internet browser-based interface of the interface provider will be considered as the transactions initiated or the orders entered through the electronic banking services distribution channels of the service bank, and will replace the customer's request or instruction. The most important part of the rules set in some countries, which concerns financial institutions and service banks, is the service contract between them in order for the service bank to provide service to an interface provider. According to some sources, in accordance with the rules set in some countries, the requirements to be included in the aforementioned contract are listed below. 1. In the contract to be concluded between the interface provider and the customer, it should be clearly emphasized that the interface provider is not a bank with an operating license or, in cases where it has not obtained the necessary operating permits, a payment service provider or any other financial institution subject to an operating permit. 2. In the contract to be established between the interface provider and the customer, the service bank internet connection regarding the banking services provided by the service bank, the services offered by the service bank and the responsibilities of the service bank, the terms of the contract between the service bank and the customer and other terms of use of the service bank services. The web page address of the customer services offered by the service bank and the call center telephone number must be clearly stated in order for the customer to convey his requests and complaints to the service bank. 3. A copy of the type agreement between the interface provider and the customer, and a copy of the type agreement between the service bank and the customer, must be placed on the home page of the interface provider's website. 4. The logo and name of the service banks from which the service is received must be included so that it will appear on the home page of the interface provider's website. 5. If the service bank issues a card payment instrument for the interface provider, the bank's name and logo must appear on the said payment instrument. 6. The confidential data transferred to the interface provider in line with the customer's request, provided that it is directly related to the establishment or performance of the contract between the interface provider and the customer, except in cases where processing is necessary. Processing is necessary for the interface provider to fulfill its legal obligation, and processing is necessary for the establishment, use or protection of a right for the interface provider. It should not be processed by the interface provider or on behalf of the interface provider by parties other than the service bank from which the interface provider receives service, and the data in question must be processed only to the extent and time required by these circumstances. 7. System and data backups in which confidential data are processed by the interface provider or the parties from which the interface provider receives service on behalf of the interface provider must be kept in the country. 8. The service bank is responsible for ensuring the confidentiality and security of customer secret data, limited to the support services received by the service bank from the interface provider and the services it provides to the interface provider, and ensuring that the transactions to be performed through the service channels of the interface provider comply with the identity verification and transaction security criteria. It should be possible to conduct audits before the interface provider and to examine the relevant information, documents and records. 9. In case it is determined that the information systems and service channels used by the interface provider in processing confidential data do not meet the obligations, or in case the permission given to the interface provider to provide service to the service bank as a support service institution is revoked, the service bank shall allow the contract to be terminated immediately before the expiry of its term. Required. 10. It is obligatory that the services provided to the service bank and the services received from the service bank cannot be transferred by the interface provider. After talking about the things that should be in the service contract between the service bank in order to serve an interface provider, one of the most important issues is that the services that the banks will provide to the interface providers through service model banking, and the services they can provide to the interface providers within the framework of the bank's current operating permits, are required to act to the Banking Regulation and Supervision Board. It is among the issues specifically stated in the rules set in some countries. Again, in accordance with the principle of transparency, which is important in the banking sector, the service bank is obliged to provide information on the Internet site about the list of all interface providers it provides service and the scope of its services in a way that shows which banking services it provides. In addition, the service bank is obliged to send a copy of each service contract it has signed with the interface providers and of each contract amendment that envisages a change in the scope of the services it will provide to the interface provider, in writing, within 1 week following the date of signature. In order for the service bank to sign a service contract with the interface provider with the rules set in some countries, it is required that the relevant interface provider be authorized by some banking institutions as a support service institution. In order for an interface provider to work with more than one service bank, it is subject to the approval of the Banking Regulation and Supervision Agency upon its application. It has been specifically stated that the permission to be granted by some banking institutions in this context will not eliminate the obligations of interface providers arising from other legislation. With the rules set in some countries, the Banking Regulation and Supervision Agency has been authorized to determine the technical criteria, procedures and principles regarding the open banking services that service banks will provide to interface providers. Another important regulation within the scope of the rules set in some countries, and another important regulation within the scope of consumer law, is that the interface provider allows the service bank to provide banking services in addition to its customers over the developed interface, and in this context, in return for the service fee paid to the service bank, if any. Some banking institutions are authorized to revoke the permission given to the interface provider in case it is determined that all kinds of fees, expenses, commissions and benefits that it will demand from its customers are used to circumvent these provisions, or that the support services offered by the interface provider to the service bank are not in accordance with the provisions of the relevant legislation. Conclusion. As explained in detail above, the rules set in some countries on the operating principles of digital banks and service model banking. Service model banking has entered modern life, and with an orientation from traditional technology to digital, non-bank institutions can cooperate with banks to provide all the services of banking. It is aimed to operate in non-bank institutions in the market. With these regulations, as in the rest of the world, with the digital orientation, it is clear that non-bank institutions will make great contributions to financial technology, especially in banking services, and will make great innovations together with banks. As a result, in accordance with the regulations made within the scope of the rules set in some countries, service model banking strengthens the cooperation between financial institutions and banks, on the one hand, and on the other hand, it is of great importance as it enables non-bank institutions to enter the market and enable banking transactions outside of bank platforms.
Thank you for watching. Reading is boring, so we will be sharing interesting things about world and life with you. Share, like and subscribe, you know what to do. Leave a comment what you are interested in so we can do an episode about it too.